Hi, everybody. Welcome to Grand Strand Action Together's event tonight on voter suppression. Thanks, y'all, for joining us. We'll give everybody a minute to log on and to become a part of our meeting. We have a really important topic tonight to discuss. We're going to be looking at voter suppression tactics in the United States and in South Carolina in specific. We're going to learn that we're going to be addressing some of these things in the coming year, probably years. And so we want to hear from our local experts about the situation and what we can do to get involved. So I'll just go ahead and announce myself. My name is Julinna Oxley. I'm the co-founder of Grand Strand Action Together. And I have my co-partner in crime, Tess Emiroglu tonight, and she is the one of the founding members of Grand Strand Action Together. And so we have our panelists tonight who we are going to interview and discuss what we're doing locally with respect to voter suppression. We're really excited to have Randy German with us tonight. Randy is the chair of our subcommittee on political activism and political outreach with respect to gerrymandering. So he's going to be telling more about what we GSAT are doing locally and who we're partnering with and that kind of thing. Tess, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our second guest.
Sure. So our first speaker is going to be my former professor, Dr. Drew Kerlowski, assistant professor of politics at Coastal. So he's going to go ahead and give us some background on gerrymandering and voter suppression in South Carolina.
Thanks, Tess. I appreciate it. Really glad to be here with everyone. I've been sort of, I guess, a long time or a short time lurker on the GSAT Facebook page, but happy to be a part of this forum today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a couple. I'm trying not to be lecture-y. I really hope everyone can see that, but I just wanted to take a couple minutes to talk broadly about voter suppression, and then maybe to talk particularly about a couple of topics that are important to me. The first thing I'd like to maybe just start out with, I don't know if anyone has heard of this, but the 2000s, the early 2010s, I started to hear this phrase about voting as a privilege, and it sort of stuck in my craw a little bit. And I didn't care for it that much because we think about natural right and we think about the Declaration and being endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. I don't like to think about any of those rights as being, something bestowed upon me by a government that could then take it away, right? And I think really we do need to refocus our view of voting as a right. And there are a couple problems with this. Specifically related to what people might say about, being enshrined or entrenched in the Constitution as an absolute right. Which I would say a couple of different things. Number one, the founders never envisioned or expected that every single right that we had would be in the Constitution. They leave this little clause at the end saying, just because we didn't mention it's not a right doesn't mean it's not a right. Right? We also have the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which specifically mentions that government cannot abridge the right to vote on the basis of a number of different things. But obviously, we know, unfortunately, that this is not the case, and that I'll use dilution and suppression separately, but I'll explain them just in a second. When I mean vote dilution, I mean more akin to what we think about when we think about gerrymandering. And that is not that we're explicitly denying someone the ability to cast a ballot, but that we are, through some sort of political machination, again, the drawing of district boundaries in this case, that we're able to make their vote somehow worth less than someone else's vote, which is obviously a violation of equal protection. There are plenty of other things, too, that I think ought to be on our radar in terms of suppression. And I think thankfully, if anything, the pandemic has brought to light a lot of these really neat innovations that other states have experimented with. I'd point specifically at the reduced absentee balloting restrictions, no excuse absentee balloting, the expansion of early voting, polling place sort of relocation was interesting in terms of the idea that we could vote at all these satellite locations. And I think we've had a taste, right? Unfortunately, a lot of these things are used or rather withheld in order to again, try to suppress the vote, to make it more difficult to vote. And this is something I think we all need to keep in mind. I was asked specifically to kind of come and talk a little bit about gerrymandering, right? And gerrymandering just broadly, for everyone who's not familiar with the term, it's a term from the founding era. But gerrymandering is simply the crafting of legislative boundaries to produce some political advantage. And this could be the dilution of one group or the promotion of another. It can be on the basis of race. It can be on the basis of partisanship, what have you. But generally speaking, we're talking about the manipulation of these legislative boundaries. The state legislature, the state Senate districts, most generally, we're thinking about, I think, U.S. congressional districts. To give you an idea just of what this looks like, okay? If I had an imaginary state with 64 residents, and trust me, there are 64 squares, and they are equally divided amongst Republicans and Democrats. Now, I have the task of districting. I have the task of creating 4 equal-sized geographic shapes, right? I can draw those boundaries in a number of different ways, but when I begin to draw them in odd or sort of tendrily type ways, I can change the outcome of elections without changing any of the underlying partisanship of these 64 voters. Let's say the Democrats are in control of the legislature in South Carolina and are able to draw these districts. Although the underlying partisanship of the state is an equal 32-32, I have drawn these sort of odd districts that give an advantage to the Democratic Party, giving them 3 seats to 1. And you can see how I've done it. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, my mouse pointer. I've packed 16 Republican voters into one district. In an urban a core area of a city, you might see this with packing minority voters into one district to minimize the influence that they might have in other surrounding districts. I could equally crack them, as Republicans do in plenty states. I will mention this is a bipartisan problem, and interestingly, some of the recent cases that we have seen, the worst offenders in Maryland, Democrats, and Wisconsin, Republicans. This is say it's an equal opportunity partisan problem, but I've taken the same underlying voters and now created a map which benefits Republicans. Unfortunately, what we all too often see are maps that don't even necessarily benefit a party, but benefit incumbents by creating these overly safe districts where there's no competition at all, right? Again, I would say I was almost equally detrimental to our democracy. The problem with all of this is coming up with a way to solve this problem. And I mentioned there have been some pretty important recent court cases, and unfortunately, the Supreme Court has sort of punted, and they've said this is a problem that is in the realm of politics, and it's not something that the courts can decide. And so they've left it up to us. And I would think that there are a couple different ways that we could think to handle this. And I know we'll talk about this, so I'm just going to throw this out there really briefly, because I know that I think the conversation will go this way. We can talk about who gets to draw these lines. Voters should choose their elected officials. Elected officials should not choose their voters, okay? We can use technology to create competitive or to create compact districts with GIS technology, so that we're not doing it on the basis of who lives in one district, and I want to make sure that that factory is in my district, and I want to make sure that that donor is in my district. Okay. I'll come back if you want to talk. This is what I do with my kids. You cut the sandwich, you get to pick which half of the sandwich you get to eat. This is actually a proposed method for districting, right? The Republicans draw the map, The Democrats get to freeze a district and then draw a new map. All right. I would say, though, too, prevention is always better than a cure, this is something that I proselytize about at every opportunity. So I'm going to do it really quickly right now. One of the most important pieces of voting legislation ever passed, or perhaps the most important, is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Not only because of its statutory enforcement of the 15th Amendment, but because of something very special called preclearance. Preclearance is the prevention, okay? And what preclearance basically means, you can see in the top part here, whenever a state or any subdivision, a political subdivision, would want to enact a qualification for voting, a prerequisite to voting, a standard, a practice, or a procedure, if you want to do that, such practice, prerequisite, procedure can be enforced if it has been submitted to the Attorney General, the Department of Justice of the United States, and the Attorney General has not interposed an objection, which means we look at these rules and these changes and these districting maps in advance, because prevention is so much better than a cure. Because once we understand there's a problem, the election might be over. It might be too late. Okay. Unfortunately, if you're familiar with recent litigation, Shelby County versus Holder out of Alabama, it basically meant that here's a map. This is a great website. I'm happy to pass this along. This is from if you look the formula behind the Voting Rights Act. This pre-clearance only applied to certain areas of the United States. The colored, I guess it's like a bluish color down here. I don't know. I'm colorblind. I'm sorry. And the Shelby County versus Holder case basically said this was an outdated map. And so now pre-clearance applies to no one. And they've put this back in Congress's hands, and they've said, make a new formula, and Congress has refused to act. And I try to act in a spirit of bipartisanship, but this is almost entirely because of the obstinance and opposition of the Republican Party and their failure to work on this. We could come up with many different forms. This is a really neat website I encourage you to go to, right? So let's look at states where there are large registration gaps between Black and white citizens, right? Let's look at where there are more voter registration, voter discrimination lawsuits. Let's look at places where we see, underlying prejudice. There are ways to somehow figure out how to bring the Voting Rights Act back. I'd also suggest as a Hail Mary pass, right? This is language from Heather Gerken. Maybe it's time for another constitutional amendment. And I love this text. The rights of the citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president, vice president, for electors of president, vice president, for senator or representative shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state. Let's stop playing around and pretending that there's not a true right to vote. Let's put that in the Constitution. So that is my TED Talk, as it were. And I hope I stayed in about 10 minutes. I'm used to having an hour and 15 minutes to fill. But hopefully we can continue the conversation a little bit after we've heard from the other presenters.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. That gave a great overview of what the problem is in terms of all the different tactics that have been pursued to suppress the vote so that there's no competition, right? Which is one of the things that I understand to be the case, especially in South Carolina. So yeah, I mean, Randy, go ahead, Drew.
I was like, yeah, I mean, I could have spent, you could spend hours on this list. And here's the problem, that a lot of these are somewhat new because in the wake of that Supreme Court decision, states across the South, including South Carolina, Texas, just immediately began adopting some of these new provisions, which would have been immediately intercepted by the Department of Justice, moving and closing polling places in rural or predominantly Black areas, enacting brand new voter identification laws. These are horrific issues.
So you've got this up here. Can you say something about which ones have been predominant in South Carolina since the Voting Rights Act was gutted.
Right. So, I mean, one that I think we have, and we do not need to have, the largest permissible, or rather the earliest permissible deadline for voter registration at 30 days out. That's the longest permissible deadline. There's no reason for that. Plenty of states have what we call election day registration or same day registration. It's a one-stop shop where you can go in and register to vote and vote on election day. I think we are much too restrictive on students. This is one that's particularly meaningful to me. Our early voting again, and why do we not have what's called no excuse absentee balloting? We saw how well early voting worked this year, and for all of the detractors, it worked, I think, amazingly well. And I think a lot of people were very happy to vote early. But right now we require these silly excuses, which are not even enforceable. Or, I mean, how are we validating whether or not someone's on a vacation during the election? Voter identification is one that particularly irritates me because it's not clear that this sort of voter fraud, right, as opposed to election fraud, there is no evidence that this sort of thing exists. It's simply an obstacle to voting for people who do not have the correct paperwork or the wherewithal or means to come up with identification. Particularly ruthless, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was reading about that some people, especially who were born a fairly long time ago, like don't even have proper paperwork because people weren't even necessarily born in hospitals.
Absolutely.
Back where they issued birth certificates. In South Carolina, you could be born in like a rural area and not be issued a birth certificate. People like in your family don't know exactly how old you are. You may not know exactly how old you are.
Absolutely. I mean, again, even if it's available to you, the procedural hurdles to requesting, to paying for it, getting all of these, it's an absolutely unnecessary hurdle that only exists, I feel like, to assuage these unfounded fears that people are impersonating others to vote, right? And I think it's just a red herring.
Yeah, that seems right.
But again, these are things that would not have otherwise, I think, been able to make it through that DOJ pre-clearance when the Voting Rights Act was in effect. And it's telling. It's telling that these are the things that states do when they're no longer being looked at.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a problem. Have there been any steps? So you have felon disenfranchisement. I know that Florida repealed their law that prohibited felons from voting. Have there been any other states who have moved in that direction to?
Sure. And this is another one that sort of is particularly devious if you think about it. So felon disenfranchisement is one thing. A convicted felon currently serving a sentence, currently on parole or probation, is not allowed to vote until their sentence is completed. There's not really any. It's not. I mean, if that's the policy that a state chooses to pursue, that I guess that's fine. But there are other states who allow convicted felons currently serving a prison term to vote in prison. And let's not forget about, in Florida's difficulty was post punishment, right? Post sentence. That even after sentencing, it was exceptionally difficult to have your voting rights restored. And in some states still, there is a lifetime ban that if you are a convicted felon once, you have lost the franchise. But we think again about how difficult it is for people who might be in jail but not necessarily even convicted of a crime, right? Think of people who have been arraigned for a crime, charged with a crime, have not been able to meet bail, and the difficulty that they have to vote if they happen to be in custody on voting on election day, right? These problems are fairly wide, but yeah, felon disenfranchisement is one that has gotten a little bit of traction, like you mentioned in Florida, but the federal government has unfortunately given the states. Not necessarily unfortunately, historically has given the states wide latitude with respect to voting rights laws because it's never been seen as a federally granted right. And really the only thing that was between us and a lot of these laws, again, was the Voting Rights Act. Felony conviction is one of the things that is specifically allowed in the Constitution, right? So again, if a state chooses to do that, it's not necessarily unconstitutional, but we have to think about to what end is that, right? To what end are we taking away the right of these individuals to vote, especially after they've paid their debt to society or anyway.
Yeah. Let me just ask one last question. So how do all these attempts to suppress the vote, how does it affect voter participation? Like I know that like in the United States, you have to actually make an effort to register to vote. And our voter turnout, I don't know what it is, but I think it's around 50% or something like that. Whereas in other countries, if they automatically register you to vote, maybe they have the actual right to vote. So then like you have a much higher turnout.
Sure. I mean, again, it's just another hurdle. It's another hurdle. Our voter turnout is exceptionally dependent on what election, which election, right? In a good presidential year, we can see average voter turnout rates across the states in the low 60s to mid 60s. We actually did really, really well, pandemic aside. We had really high voter turnout in 2020. When you look at midterm election years, so in the years where we only have a congressional race without a top of the ticket presidential race, those numbers can be in the 30s. And yeah, compared to other developed democracies, those numbers are pretty low. And in a lot of these states or a lot of these other nations, as you mentioned, that registration, just like we, for example, with Social Security, right? Everyone has a Social Security number. Right? You are registered. The duty falls on the government to make sure you are registered to vote rather than falling on the individual. And again, I think this gets to this misconception or this sort of difference between understanding voting as a privilege that requires additional work. Like for some reason, we need to make it hard because you need to earn it. I just fundamentally disagree with that, right? It has been earned. It is endowed by our Creator. It is inalienable, unalienable. And putting these barriers in between people and the ballot is unconscionable.
That seems good. That seems right. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Sorry, I may be a little proselytizing a little too hard here, but
no, it's great.
I have strong views, particularly on.
Yeah, no, I don't think I realized that we didn't have an amendment that said we had the right to vote. I don't know. It never occurred to me.
15th Amendment says that you cannot abridge the right to vote on a basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? But it's not an absolute.
Right. And it also doesn't say that you can't be prohibited in voting, like the thing that you wrote, that it needs to be expanded in a stronger way. Okay, so Tess, you're saying that we have a question from the audience. Tess, do you have that question in front of you?
Yes. So, okay, I'm not sure that I'm exactly understanding the question, but this question is from Ken Kruger, and Dr. Kurlowski, you might be able to answer this. He's asking how many of the voter suppression laws that we're seeing from state legislatures right now are kind of copycat laws from state to state. And if that is the case, that, that's what's happening, is there a concerted effort by a group to block certain groups of voters? So, is there an organization besides the parties that has an interest, I think, is what Ken is asking here.
Yeah, so on the side of these restrictions, again, they are, or suppression effects, right? So obviously from my view, I call them voter suppression efforts. And from the view of proponents, obviously they wouldn't call them that. They would call them efforts for, generally use the term like election security, right? Efforts to safeguard our elections. And again, they're usually enacted on the basis of I'd call a myth, but at least, a story of pervasive individual voter fraud. Right? These stories of buses of individuals showing up who are voting multiple times without ID. Just wild stories. Now, it's also worth noting that some of these voter registration is nothing new. And in fact, if anything, voter registration looks as liberal as it has in the history of our country. Because let's not forget, in order to register to vote in the state of South Carolina about 80 years ago, you needed to pass a literacy test. You needed to pay a poll tax. Okay, so we've done a little bit of work chipping away at those things. The registration itself still exists. The voter identification is something new. Obviously, no one had a driver's license in the 19-teens. We had a challenge system. If someone thought that you weren't who you were, they said, that's not Drew Kerlowski. I know that guy. You're much too good looking to be Drew Kerlowski, right? So there are groups out there, but none of them. There are groups that put together what we call like model legislation, like ALEC on the right, but none of them would ever couch this in terms of a voter suppression effect. They would couch this in terms of election security. So that's what you really want to look. Again, are you familiar? I don't know if anybody's familiar with ALEC.
Yeah, I'm familiar with
they're one of the biggest clearinghouses for more conservative model policies, and they have some election.
So even if the intention behind the legislation is not to block a specific group of people, is the consequence of the legislation that it is disproportionately affects certain groups of people? Obviously the poor, like people of color, women, like what is the consequence that it affects people differently?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I don't want to. I'm not bring up my list again or anything like that. But if you look at these things, a lot of these, in terms of identification, registration, they hit at these barriers to voting where individuals who might not have flexibility of schedule, flexibility of childcare, flexibility of work hours, flexibility of finance, might find it difficult. Let's not forget, you're required to get to have time off to vote. You're not necessarily required to be paid for that time, and not everyone's situation are they even able to forego the wages, even if they're allowed to forego the wages. So yeah, these things disproportionately hit at the elderly. They disproportionately hit at people who are transient, like young college students. Like, well, where are you? Where's your driver's license? I think all the time about our coastal students who have difficulty voting because they're not sure if they should vote in their home state or if they're allowed to vote here. Yeah. But yeah, the effects are always going to be disproportionate on people who have limited resources. Again, gerrymandering sort of hits a couple different ways, but in our state, I'll give you measuring the extent of partisan gerrymandering. The Republicans in our state have essentially gerrymandered the Democrats out of one seat. The Democrats should have one additional seat if the state were fairly partisanly districted. It's clear that disenfranchises Democratic voters, and I think it's clear maybe what the interests are who are represented there by those Democratic voters. Those voices are not being heard in Washington.
Would you say that there's a clear area of the state where that is, like maybe where this District 1 and District 6 sort of meet?
Maybe, yeah, it's hard. You look at ours. The 7th is a very red district, which includes some areas around the I-95 corridor, which might otherwise be fairly blue. But there's been a lot of litigation about whether or not you can, to what extent can you try to draw those districts, to draw them fairly. And this is the problem in North Carolina, right? If you actually look at the case law on gerrymandering in North Carolina, has always been in trouble. They were sued. A group of white voters, conservative white voters, actually sued. Sorry about the cry. Actually sued that some minority districts had been too contrively drawn, there was a district, the I-73 district, they called it, that went from Charlotte up to Raleigh, I think. And they said that somebody had been quoted as saying, if you'd open up your car doors driving through the district, you'd kill everybody in the district, right? It was only as wide as the lane of traffic. But again, I mean, can you? So the question becomes: I mean, are you able to grab those voters, Dillon, Chesterfield, and incorporate them into so that, like, the language in the statutes and the court cases talk about are there groups which are compact and contiguous enough to elect a candidate of choice, and does the opposing party act to thwart that?
So I think that's kind of a good segue to this question that I was going to hold off for the larger group discussion, but it fits in with what we're talking about right now. So I remember 3 years ago when we had this lecture in class, you talked about, a district kind of like the 6th district in South Carolina, and what might happen if we ungerrymander the state. Do, minorities who are represented in the 6th district, even though we could create, more competitive, more fair elections, they potentially risk losing that seat. So, I think that at the core issue, fairness, just elections, it takes prevalence. But I think then that's something to also consider, is making sure that everybody has fair representation. And so I guess my question is, what are the potential cost, if any, of not guaranteeing that there are minority majority districts?
Yeah, so the problem of not having majority minority districts, that's what sort of what you're getting at. What if we don't have those voices?
Right.
We're getting at this discussion that you probably know in class. We talk about the idea of descriptive representation. Does my representative look like me? Or substantive representation? Can they represent my interests? And this sort of almost gets back to what I talked about when I talked about the districts not necessarily being gerrymandered for a party one way or another, but being gerrymandered so safe that people don't even have to try. And that's where I feel like we really lose representation. I'm okay with a district that might be, but if it's not majority minority, it's still has a what we call maybe like a population of influence, right? But where a candidate, even if it is, let's say, a white Republican, still has to engage communities of color in that district because the seat is competitive. And when you can count on winning 65 to 35 every year, you no longer have to engage with those communities. And there's not even substantive representation, even if you don't have the descriptive representation. I think it is important for our country, for feelings of efficacy and cynicism, to make sure that we have a legislature that is at least somewhat descriptively representative of our population in terms of gender and race and color and but we at least need to have districts that are competitive enough where representatives must cater to the concerns of all constituents and substantively represent people of all races, colors, and genders, right? But I think, the risk is that those voices are silenced in DC and that those concerns are not heard when it comes time to form policy. And that is incredibly important, because these are, again, the voices that we're silencing are voices that have been traditionally marginalized in our politics, and that only compounds the problem.
Drew, I've got some statistics that lend support to what you're saying here. If you look at our 2020 election in South Carolina, the state Senate and state representatives, we have 170 altogether. Out of that 170, only 6 flipped from one party to the other. 96.5%, in other words, 164 out of those 170 were safely held by the incumbent. And that's largely due to what Drew is talking about here. The voters in many areas feel like their vote doesn't count. It's not going to make a difference. In many cases, there's only one name on the ballot because nobody will run against the incumbent because they don't have a chance. And I could go further and argue that, yes, if you look at what our congressional makeup district should be, yeah, clearly there should be 2 Democrats if you fairly represent the state. But if you also factor in the fact that many, especially minority voters, don't even bother to vote, if they felt like they had a say and got out and voted, we would have 3 Democrats. And so it's the voter suppression aspect of the gerrymandering is a big factor as well.
So I'm happy to see if we can get this link so people can play with this after the talk. Right, this is what the state could look like with highly competitive elections. And it's exactly what you're talking about, right? Where you have probably three competitive districts. And so in a good year for Democrats, you're taking home 3 of those seats, right? And again, you're getting that corridor coming down where now we've created a majority. But so this is with 538, if you're familiar with 538. And this is what they call their Atlas of Redistricting. And they draw maps of each state in a number of different ways. You can see the current boundaries. You can see what happens if they were allowed to, if the Democrats were perhaps allowed to gerrymander or whatever, or if we wanted to maximize these majority minority districts, what it would look like. Or as I mentioned, maybe if we let the computer draw some shapes. But anyway, we can make sure that we put a link in that so people can play around with that after, perhaps.
That's great. Thank you. So Randy, yeah. So what you're saying is sort of totally, y'all are bouncing off each other. Great. So Randy, one of the things we've talked about is that in South Carolina, our districts are so rigged that we don't even have people to run as Democrats because they know they're not going to win because they're so heavily rigged in favor of Republicans. And I think, as Drew mentioned, typically every race is won with a 65-35 split. And so you might think, as a result of that, you might think that 35% of the people in the entire state of South Carolina are Democrats and 65% Republicans. But that's not even true. It's actually closer to 50-50 or 45-55. So it literally shows that, like, when you look at the breakdown of this state, that it doesn't reflect the actual, demographics or the tendencies that people have to vote in favor of one area or the other. So Randy, I'm just going to kind of turn it over to you to sort of talk about some of these problems that are unique to South Carolina and talk about some of the things that we're trying to do to fix them.
Okay, and I want to offer to you guys and Drew, feel free to interject at any time if you have something you want to contribute. Picking up on this, just the same topic real quick, if you look at our 7 congressional districts in the 2020 election, only 1 of those 7 had what could be considered a competitive election, and that was District 1, where it flipped back to Republican control by a margin of 1.3% in the vote. All the other 6 districts were nowhere near competitive. The incumbents, whether it's Jim Clyburn's district or the other Republican districts, were safe because of at least partially because of the way the district boundaries are drawn. But I want to go on and talk a little bit more about the ill effects of the gerrymandering of the voting districts. We've talked about how it suppresses vote, which is bad enough, but it also leads to other effects. When the incumbents feel so safe that they don't have to worry about being reelected if they have any competition at all, then one thing that leads to is they don't feel like they have to serve the voters. They start feeling like, well, I need to make sure I'm satisfying my donors or my political bosses more so than the voters, because the voters aren't really an issue to me anymore. And that leads to things like where in our state, South Carolina ranks like 43rd out of 50 in the nation in terms of education. We're ranked 45th in wages. We're one of the few states that one of the states that has no minimum wage law. Life expectancy in South Carolina ranks 42nd out of 50. We declined to take the Medicaid expansion that was offered to us that could have given healthcare coverage to 250,000 people in our state that don't have healthcare coverage. We decided, no, we don't want that. Our crime rates are high. I think we rank 46th in crime rate. We rank 45th in terms of how many women are serving in our state legislature. We do good in some things. We rank 8th in prison population. We rank 7th in socially transmitted diseases. So there's things like that that tell us our government isn't really working for the people. And these are the things that not having competitive elections and not having people who feel like they can make a difference with their vote lead us to. So I'll get off my bandwagon with that and talk a little bit more about what we're doing, what GSAT is doing. As Julinna mentioned earlier, we have an election reform committee, and that's the committee that I'm in charge of right now. And we have been focusing on this gerrymandering issue for the past 3 or 4 years. Our ultimate goal is to get an independent citizens commission. Drew mentioned that early on in his talk, to draw the district boundaries, get the fox out of the hen house, and have an independent citizens commission that would draw the district boundaries for the state legislature and the 7 congressional districts. And so it would be done using a tool like the 538. It would be done in a fair and nonpartisan manner. The goal would be to have competitive elections so that people can feel like they can be engaged in the democracy that we have and not suppressed from it. And that would lead to politicians who actually care about the voters and would serve them better. So that's our ultimate goal. Now, when we have a strategy, we work with a number of other organizations in the state. We are aligned with a group called Fair Maps that's organized by the South Carolina Progressive Network. We work very closely with them. We are also connected with Common Cause, with the South Carolina Appleseed Legal Justice Center, with the League of Women Voters, and other organizations. And we're all working together this year, especially because the redistricting is happening again this year. It's been delayed until September now because of the issues with the census data. The census data from the 2020 census is now going to be released to the states at the end of September. And at that point, our state legislature will probably conduct a special session, and they'll do what they've done in the past. They'll go behind closed doors and use their computer models and come out with maps that look kind of like the ones we have now. And they'll give a 2-hour notice for the public meeting that they'll have on it. And we expect that they'll re-gerrymander our state. So this year, to try to get a better result, all those organizations I mentioned before, plus the NAACP just came to mind. There's a strategy discussion going on amongst those organizations to try to influence a better result this time around. One of the things that'll be happening is that coalition of organizations is going to propose its own maps to the state legislature and say, here, these are fair maps. These are competitive maps. These do not disenfranchise voters. Why don't you use maps like these? So that's one thing that will be happening. The other thing is trying to encourage as much public awareness of the redistricting process, public education about it, which I thank you guys for furthering in this meeting, and public engagement in the process by contacting your legislators, by bringing forward grievances with the way that the districts are drawn. If you live in an area that is prone to flooding and your representatives are doing little or nothing about it because they don't feel like they need to, could be a grievance. If you're a minority community and you feel like the neighborhood across the street is in another district, why? Any sort of grievance with the way things are now, if we have the public bringing those forward, it will help, because we fully anticipate that when the legislature does its thing, they're going to be just as badly gerrymandered now, if not worse, because of what Drew pointed out earlier. The Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act has been gutted, and they have an even more free hand to do what they want to than they had when they drew the districts we have now, because they don't have to go through that pre-clearance process anymore. So it could be even worse than what we've got now when we're done. So we're anticipating that they're going to exercise their power to shape the districts in ways that benefit one party over the other and suppress voters and so forth. And it's going to end up in litigation. And there are several organizations that are already preparing to litigate the districts that are drawn by the politicians that want to stay in power and not have any competition. So the more that we can get the public engagement going and bringing forward issues that can serve to make the litigation more successful when we get to that point, the better. So that's real quick and dirty, the basic strategy that I see forming amongst the League of Women Voters and the NAACP and the Legal Justice Center and Progressive Network and those organizations that are having these strategy discussions now. So getting back to GSAT here, our group we're staying in touch with what that strategy is, and our focus is on trying to facilitate that public awareness, public education, and public engagement. We also have initiated a fundraising effort to help us do those things. Anyone who is interested in getting involved in this, I'll go put my contact information in the chat box, I guess, so you can reach out to me. But that's what we're about in a nutshell.
Hey Randy, do you know what happened to the attempt last legislative session to institute an independent redistricting commission, or if there's any plans to bring back that legislation this year?
Yes, it never got out of committee.
Okay.
And it won't. It won't.
Right.
Unlike some states, like Michigan, for example, went to an independent commission. But they were able to do that because their state constitution allows for a statewide referendum.
Right.
And the voters then have a means of bypassing the state legislature and say, we don't like what you guys are doing, and we want an independent citizens commission, and we're going to do that by virtue of a voter referendum. Well, South Carolina doesn't allow that. And I can get into the history of that. That dates back to 125 years ago, when the population in our state was more minority than it was white. And they wanted to make sure that white people stayed in power, so they couldn't have anything like that. So our hands are kind of tied. We have no way of achieving, getting to the Independent Citizens Commission without going through the state legislature. Now we can have some success in the courts. South Carolina is one of the states that has a what's called a free elections clause in our constitution, in our state constitution. So that gives us some leverage. And if we get some grievances going about suppression of minority vote, that's another angle that can lend us some success in the courts. Hopefully we can make it better this time around. And then that's our strategy for this year. Our longer term strategy involves using county level referendums. South Carolina does allow for the as an equivalent of a county level referendum. So if we can get a series of counties, the voters in, I think we need 15% of the voters in any given county in the state. If 15% of the voters in that county sign a petition that says we want an independent citizens commission to do the redistricting, then that county commission or county government is required to either pass a resolution supporting that, saying our county wants this, and thereby putting pressure on the legislators, or the county has to put it on a county ballot and put it out for a vote in the county. And if we do a good job with the public education and public awareness, we know that about 2/3 of the voters, regardless of party, once they understand these issues, they would support an independent citizens commission. So by using these county referendums, that gives us another success path. It's a longer term success path because we've got a lot of public education to do in order to make that happen. But that's plan B that we'll go back to after we focus this year on the redistricting itself and the litigation aspect.
Okay, good. That's useful. So Randy, just to make sure I understand you correctly, you're not putting a lot of stock in the independent commission just yet because there's just no way to get there yet. So the first step is just voter education, to understand the issues, sort of outreach into the community. And then within a year or two, or maybe longer, it might take I know that I signed one of the resolutions that we're circulating. So GSAT has one, and we're trying to get 15% of Horry County voters. Is that right? Do you want to just say a little bit about that so that people can learn more about it?
Yes, and we are trying to get 15% of Horry County voters, but for this year, we put that on the back burner because we want to try to leverage the litigation that's down the road as much as possible this year. But once that's all done, then yes, we're going to get back on. We're going to continue public awareness and public education, but we'll get back and refocus on the petition drive and trying to get the 15%. Our team is actually working more on getting Richland County to the 15% level because that's Columbia.
Right.
And we can get press coverage there because their county council is going to be much more disposed to supporting this than Horry County's county council will be. So we want to get Richland County first, leverage that, and then work on other counties. So that would be the fundamental strategy once we get back to the petition drive after we've done what we can do with litigation.
And Randy hits the nail on the head with the Voting Rights Act thing. This is exactly why pre-clearance was so important, because you could ensure that these maps were going to be looked at by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice to ensure we hadn't unduly diluted the vote of communities of color across the state. And it's not that that's still not absolutely unconstitutional and illegal. It's just we've lost a method of enforcing it, right? Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act still says you can go to court. The 15th Amendment still is in effect, but that's after the fact litigation, and that's costly. This is exactly why the Voting Rights Act needs to be back in place, so that these individual instances don't have to be litigated every single time. You can get away with it once, right? With pre-clearance, you couldn't.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's a quick fix for all of this if we could pass HR 1.
There you go.
In the United States Congress, I forgot what they call it, Drew, the For the People Act or something.
Yeah, I forget the name.
But that's federal legislation that's now, it's passed the House of Representatives. It's whether or not we can get it through the Senate, but that legislation would ban this partisan gerrymandering that's going on now and require every state to have an independent citizens commission. So if we can make that happen, it would save my team a lot of time and trouble, and we could go focus on something else. So I'm going to put a plug in for that. Anyone that any chance you get to support that legislation, it would be wonderful for our democracy.
Okay, and it's called HR 1, and it's already gone past it's already made it through the House of Representatives recently.
Yes.
Okay.
It was passed months ago.
Okay.
But with
it's getting hung up in the
the
Senate.
leadership in the Senate at that time, it wasn't going anywhere. Now, with the 50-50 situation in the Senate, it has a chance.
Okay.
It has a chance. And I can get into that too. We get into the issue of the filibuster and so forth, but it has a chance now, and that's a good thing.
And just to clarify what an independent citizens commission would be, is it people that are unregistered, or does it be like a mix of people who are registered Democrats, registered Republicans, or it's just more of like an open process rather than like a behind the closed doors process?
No, there was a specific proposal. Actually, there was several versions of legislation put forward in the legislature last year and in years past, proposing different variations of an independent citizens commission. The one that we support was one that the Progressive Network lawyers proposed, that would be a truly independent citizens commission, meaning one that once they're finished, the state legislature could not go and change the results, or the governor couldn't go and change the results. Mm-hmm. There's like 20 states in the country now that have some form of a citizens commission, but not all of them are truly independent. They're helpful, but the state legislature can go and monkey with the results of it. The ones that have truly independent commissions, the commission does its thing, and that's what's binding, that those become the districts. The one that the legislation that we were supporting would have 14 members on the commission. They would apply. The state ethics department would be responsible for making the selection of the 14 members. There would be 2 members from each of the 7 congressional districts.
Okay.
I think they were equally divided, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, because these are most likely registered voters that would be on it. I'm scratching my memory now, but the legislation was drafted, and that's kind of give you the essence of it. It would be fair with the design of not being partisan one way or the other, and the goal of making our elections competitive and fair and open to all voters without trying to favor one party over the other, or one minority or one race over another. And there are, like Drew said, there's software that is designed to do just that, and it's available.
We can draw these districts.
Our guys just don't want to use it.
Let's just stop putting our thumb on the scales for anyone and draw some fair competitive districts.
Yeah, that's
totally possible these days.
Yeah, we're together.
So we do have some questions for in our who are from folks who are watching online. So I'm going to turn it over to Tess to toss those questions out.
Sure. So I think either of you could answer this question. It's from Lorraine. The question is, would ranked choice voting help make seats more competitive in a red state like South Carolina?
Yeah, I'd say it's difficult to imagine that helping in a state where you have such a strong. So let me give you the example of where it really helps. It helps particularly with third parties, and so in Maine, for example, where ranked choice voting is currently being used, or is now newly being used. This really helps some of these perverse outcomes where you had a majority of the state who were ostensibly Democrats, but they would often split their votes between an independent candidate and a Democratic candidate. And then you had Republicans winning with a plurality, or only 40%. This is how LePage gets elected year after year after year, even though 60% of Maine is progressive, liberal Democratic. So what that does is ranked choice voting prevents the spoiler effect of a third party candidate. It can't really help with the drawing of district lines where the deck is stacked. And like I said, I like thinking of it in terms of this idea of where officials have selected their voters. But what it could do is it prevents the negative outcomes of sort of insurgent third party candidacies. It prevents, or rather it allows for some more sincere voting. I can vote for my true candidate of choice if that is a third party candidate, knowing that if that candidate does not get the amount of votes that's required for the threshold, my vote will be transferred to a major party candidate. So that's what that ranked choice voting is. I think another really great electoral innovation, but it's designed really to attack a separate problem of that spoiler effect.
Yeah, it's kind of ruined by if you've got a state that's highly gerrymandered and there's no competition in elections. If there's only one choice on the ballot, then you don't really have a ranked choice. You only have one.
Yeah, which most of the races that when I go to vote have only one person to vote.
I think it's
Randy,
like,
what the percentage of
70% of state elections are that way.
It's at least 50%. I don't know what the exact amount is though that are uncontested.
It was 70% in the 2016 election. I think it went down to 52% in the 2020 election, where there was only one name on the ballot.
Okay. That's still ridiculous. 50% of the races have literally no
choice at all.
It's crazy. All right. We got to work on that. Tess, we need at least to have a competition. All right, Tess, let's go to the next couple questions.
Let's see, they're being sent to me. Okay, this is sort of a long one. This is from Ken Kruger. So he provided an example again in Florida. He said Florida has had no excuse to absentee voting for decades. Florida had a majority of Republicans in power for decades. While Florida is still Republican, Democrats have made large inroads. Now, all of a sudden, no excuse absentee voting is, kind of frowned upon by Republicans. How do legislators justify this sudden change in philosophy, particularly when there has been no real evidence of widespread voter fraud? That's kind of an interesting question. I remember, during the last election, this was pointed to a lot, that no excuse absentee voting has never been an issue for Republicans in Florida. That's how most of their voters actually voted, mostly elderly people, and it became a problem this past year. So can anybody speak to that sort of example? Is it, I think my addition to Ken's question would be, do you think that that is Republicans in Florida maybe trying to play into a national message of fear around absentee voting or mail-in voting?
I mean, I'll defer to Drew on this because I know he's much more informed than I, but my opinion on that is yes. It's playing into the narrative on the right these days that there was massive voter fraud that really doesn't exist, and we need to make sure our elections are secure, and therefore we need to put all these additional restrictions on voters because we need to make our elections secure. And that's a false narrative, and it's designed to favor one party over the other by limiting the ability of voters who tend to vote for the other party to actually vote.
And a lot of the concerns about, again, this, I need to make the distinction between voter fraud, the individual act of someone duplicate voting or something, right, versus election fraud, right? The claims of voter fraud with regard to absentee balloting, if best practices for absentee balloting are used, that risk should be exceptionally rare. I'll give you an example. The commonly touted thing about individuals voting multiple times, right? If best practices talk about external ballot envelopes being barcoded to individual voters, right? That means only one ballot per voter gets accepted. Things about the mail, best practices would tell us that we should make sure that we have fully staffed centers so people can drop off their ballots in person. And most people prefer to drop them off in person. I will say this against early voting. There has been some research that suggests that early voting can potentially have a deleterious effect on voter turnout because it takes away some of that sort of focusing, channeling energy that's put towards election day. But interestingly, a lot of that older research seems to have been blown out of the water with 2020, right? Because these were papers that were written back in 2015, 2016, and 2017, looking at states that had, because the argument was that campaigns and parties put less effort into mobilization efforts in those early weeks. So you just really never saw, the people who took advantage of early voting were likely to vote anyway, and you never really saw an increase in turnout. But I think that this election, when the analysis comes in, we might be learning some other things about how, but in terms of being able to make an argument against absentee, I can't make that argument. I can't make that argument with a straight face. So I'm not sure why. It strikes me as that it's just an argument made in bad faith.
I can kind of speak to the first part of that a little bit as somebody whose job is to motivate people to go to the polls. I mean, that I would say not just in South Carolina with the Democratic Party here, but nationwide, we really messaged people to vote early. It was a huge part of campaigning. We really, I wouldn't say discouraged anybody from voting on election day, but we heavily encourage people to make sure that they vote early. And I think that if we hadn't done that, people probably, even with the pandemic, still would have waited to vote on election day. I think because there's so much hysteria around this idea that if you vote early or you mail in your vote, it may not get counted.
And again, you look at states that have really top-notch best practice systems. You can verify that a ballot has been sent to you online. You can verify when it's been received. You can verify that it's been counted. I mean, there are technological innovations in election administration that provide solutions to all of these problems if states are willing to put forward the resources to creating truly accessible and secure elections. But it's not about suppression. It's about innovation. Right, and that's how we make sure we have secure, safe elections that are open to the greatest extent of people possible.
And we have a paper trail so that we can audit them after the fact.
Finally, now we do, right?
To verify that it was accurately done.
Yeah. It took us 20 years with those old systems not having that to finally get that. Again, other states have had this for, there's no excuse really, right? Except for a lack of will.
And from what I understand, even some of the, I mean, some of the commentators were saying the 2020 election was one of the most secure elections in recent history. And so for someone to claim that there was massive voter fraud was like so far off the charts wrong, right? That it was like, which to me is a form of messaging that also seeks to disenfranchise the vote, right? To discourage people from voting, to think that the system is flawed, to think that it's rigged, that they can't trust it. That just further exacerbates the problems surrounding voting. And I heard that a number of people who are proud to work election polls were like feeling like quitting after this because they were so discouraged and feeling personally attacked from the suggestion that that their work was that they were cheating the system, that they were cheating in some regard.
Well, it's such an absurd accusation too, because it doesn't matter where in the country you go. There are people from both parties, just normal, everyday people who sign up to work the polls on election day. Here, I mean, in Horry County, I know plenty of Democrats, ages 60 and up mostly, who volunteer to work the polls on election day. So, you know, it's
Of both parties.
yeah, they're mostly elderly people who just want to do their civic duty, and it's a crazy thing to try to say that these are the people who are manipulating the outcomes of the election.
Right. There, you know, it's about having I hate to be like pedantic professor, but it's about having precise language for the types of things that we're talking about, right? You know, did Russia or some foreign country have an involvement? It's not in voter fraud. It's in perhaps something like voter disinformation. Right? It's a manipulation of opinion. It's not backroom miscounting of votes or hacking into voting systems that aren't even connected to the internet. I mean, these wild fantasy tales. It's like, were there serious voter dis or misinformation campaigns in play probably in the last 2 elections? Absolutely. But were these elections conducted from an administrative standpoint in a secure fashion? I'd say absolutely. But we conflate the two, right?
Yeah. Two different things. Well, y'all, typically we keep these at an hour, and we are pushing an hour and 15 minutes because this issue is so important. So, but I just want to say, Tess, do we have anything else right now? I did see some really interesting comments on the chat. Someone mentioning that in 2010, there was a public hearing on addressing voting in Horry County to look at minority populations, and they actually used the information that was gotten from that public hearing against against Horry County and ended up changing it to where that vote was disenfranchised even more. So there's a lot going on. So I'm just going to say that we're going to do our part with GSAT to continue with voter education throughout the year. We'll try to have it. We're going to have another panel later on in the next month or 2 on this topic. So thank you to everyone who's been watching. And we especially want to thank our panelists, Dr. Drew Kerlowski from Coastal Carolina University and Randy German, who's our coordinator for vote for what is your title, Randy?
The team is called Election Reform Team.
Election Reform Team, and Randy is now chairing that after our other friend Brian Kasperzik chaired it for a number of years. And this group is by far our most active subcommittee. They've done a lot of work, so we want to give them an extra chance to stand up here on the pedestal and spread their message. So thank you, and especially
I realize that posting my contact information on the chat box is only going to be available to the 4 of us.
Okay.
Could we put that on the Facebook page?
Yes, we will put that on the Facebook page. So then that way people can contact you to find out additional ways to get involved.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so we'll be signing off. So thanks again to all of our listeners tonight from Grandstand Action Together, and everybody have a great night. Thank you. Bye.